the Egyptian Museum in Turin, there is a piece of limestone the size of a paperback book. It is covered in hieratic script, the shorthand Egyptians used when they needed to write fast. It was written in 1170 BCE. The pharaoh whose tomb it concerns has his name on every wall, every register, every scene. The man who wrote this note signed it with a job title, Scribe of the Tomb, because that was all the system had a category for. The note says the workers have not been given their rations. They are hungry, they cannot work. He had a name. The system did not require it. 3,000 years. The same 3 words, on strike notices, ever since. That flake has sat in Turin for a century. The pharaoh has entire wings. What the limestone says, and why is the part the wings leave out? Egypt needed a workforce to build the Valley of the Kings. The workforce that cut and painted the royal tombs of the new kingdom was a community of skilled professional workers. The state housed them in a purpose-built village in the desert hills above the valley on the west bank of the Nile, across the river from ancient Thebes, in what is now Luxor. The village was called Setmat Her-Imenti Waset, the place of truth on the west of Thebes. Egyptologists call it Deir el-Medina, after the later monastery built on its ruins. At its peak in the Ramesses period, it housed between 60 and 120 families at any given time. The men were stonemasons, plasterers, painters, and scribes, workers skilled enough that the state built them a village, supplied them with food and water, and employed them for their entire working lives. Their sons often trained in the same trades, their daughters married into the community. It persisted for roughly 400 years. The work itself looked like this. They painted the gods and the pharaohs and the scenes from the Book of the Dead in pigments that have lasted 3,000 years, ochre and malachite and carbon black ground with water and applied over white gypsum plaster. They built, in other words, the most sacred construction in ancient Egypt, the eternal resting places of the divine kings, and they lived their entire lives doing it. In a village they were not permitted to leave freely, constructing spaces they would never be buried in. The village sat in a dry valley between the hills, deliberately isolated. The necropolis was sacred ground, and the people who built it carried that designation into their daily lives. Leaving requires permission. Absences were logged. The same administrative apparatus that owned their labor watched them, recorded them, and supplied them. They could build their own tombs. The western hillside above the village holds the decorated burial chambers of the craftsmen themselves, modest versions of the royal work they spent their lives producing. But they could not choose their employer, set their hours, or eat if the delivery failed. They were paid in kind. The ration system was the entire economy. Every 10 days, the state delivered grain, emmer wheat and barley, along with fish, oil, vegetables, salt, and occasionally meat and wine. These were not supplements or bonuses. They were the only income. There was no market in which a stonemason could sell his labor independently, no side work, no alternative employer to turn to, no mechanism for saving against a bad month. The ration was the wage, and the wage was the food, and when the ration did not arrive, the workers had nothing. In year 29 of the reign of Ramesses III 1170 BCE, the rations had not arrived for 18 days. The workers had no legal mechanism to demand payment. They had no right to refuse the work and seek employment elsewhere. They had no administrative category within which to register their condition as a formal grievance. No union, no tribunal, no petition process that would compel a response. The system that employed them had a classification for their labor. It had no classification for their hunger. 18 days without rations were 18 days without food. The scribe of the tomb wrote it down on a piece of limestone, and the workers walked out. What they did next, where they went, what they said, and how the most powerful state on earth responded to a group of craftsmen sitting down in the desert, is the part that the official record almost didn't survive. The Valley of the Kings is the most elaborately documented royal burial ground in the ancient world. 63 tombs cut into the limestone cliffs of the western desert, each one a structured theological program in stone and paint. The walls name the pharaoh in every register. They name the gods he encounters as he moves through the underworld. They record the spells, the gates, the guardians, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Maat. Every surface is covered. Every seam carries a caption. The texts are drawn from the Book of the Dead, the Amduat, and the Book of Gates, ancient religious compositions that guided the royal soul through the 12 hours of the night toward resurrection. The construction of these tombs was, in the official record of ancient Egypt, an act of divine maintenance. The king's eternal rest sustained the cosmic order. The workers who made it possible are not named in that record, but the workers kept records of their own. Excavators pulled roughly 3,000 ostraca limestone flakes and pottery fragments used as informal writing surfaces from the site and its surrounding rubbish heaps, along with significant numbers of papyri. Together they give us the most complete picture of any ancient working community in history. People paid to build things, whose names are in ledgers, whose daily lives are on record. The records show a community in full resolution. Absence records note who missed work and why. The foreman was brewing beer, the scribe had eye disease. Personal letters survive alongside legal disputes over property and accusations of theft. There are love notes, medical prescriptions, shopping lists, accounts of arguments between neighbors, and records of debts. There are work rosters listing the craftsmen assigned to each crew, the right side and the left side, 2 gangs cutting 2 corridors simultaneously into the rock, and ration ledgers recording deliveries of grain, fish, oil, and vegetables to individual households. The names appear throughout. Ka, the foreman of the tomb, whose excavators uncovered his intact burial in 1906, with his tools still inside his wooden cubit rod, his bronze vessels, his set square, all the instruments of a man whose job was to translate a pharaoh's afterlife requirements into precise cuts in limestone. His tomb goods were so well preserved that Egyptologists could reconstruct his household. Neferhotep, the chief workman whose complaints about ration failures fill multiple ostraca, whose frustration with the administration comes through the formal hieratic phrasing as clearly as if it were written this morning. Paneb, the craftsman who appears in the legal record as a man accused of sleeping with other men's wives, stealing state tools, threatening his foreman, and bribing his way into a senior position, a personality too disruptive for the system to ignore entirely, which is the only reason his name survived in the record with any texture at all. Amenhotep, the scribe whose hand produced the most detailed accounts of the strike, who understood that making the administration respond required documentation in the administration's own categories. These are not abstractions. They are documented individuals with careers, disputes, households, and recorded opinions about their supervisors. Their names appear in the work rosters. In year 29, 18 days without rations, they made that absence impossible to ignore. The administrative system that employed them had a precise category for their labor. It recorded how many days each man worked, what rations he received, what he was absent for, and who replaced him when he was sick. An ostracon in the Turin collection notes a man absent because he was embalming his mother. Another was building his own house. A third is listed absent with the foreman, no further explanation given or required. The system tracked all of this because it needed to know what it was getting for its grain. It did not track their authorship of the spaces they created because the wall belonged to the pharaoh. The craftsman's name had no place on a wall that belonged to someone else. And so 3,000 years later, the walls say what the walls always said: the pharaoh's name, the pharaoh's passage through the underworld, the pharaoh's gods. The administrative machinery that was supposed to supply the village, drawing on temple granaries, state storehouses, and the institutional apparatus of the Egyptian state, had broken down. Whether through corruption at the level of the local administrators, broader economic strain in a kingdom increasingly pressed by external threats and internal instability, or simple bureaucratic failure at multiple levels simultaneously, the rations did not arrive. 2 full cycles passed. For 18 days, the workers had nothing. On the 10th month of year 29, the crews walked out. They crossed the boundary wall, the physical barrier that separated the necropolis from the outside world, the line that defined the limit of their working lives, and sat down outside the mortuary temples of the pharaohs on the floodplain below. This was not a random destination. The mortuary temples held grain, and the workers knew exactly where it was stored. Sitting outside those storehouses made the argument without a word. The grain exists, we built the tomb it belongs to, and we have not been paid. The ostraca and papyri that record this event are specific about how it unfolded. The crews sat down and stated their condition in terms that forced the administrative record to acknowledge it. We have not been given our rations. We are hungry. We cannot work. The local authorities were not equipped to resolve this. The mayor of the West Bank came to the temple forecourt to negotiate. He told the workers the granaries were empty and they should go home. They refused. They sat outside the temple of Thutmose III for a day, then moved to the temple of Ramesses II. The scribes who accompanied the mayor recorded the workers' statements in administrative language, the same formal phrasing they used in every petition, because that was the only form in which the complaint could travel up the chain. The mayor eventually produced grain from the temple stores enough for one delivery, not a resolution. The workers took it and kept stating their demand. Papyrus Turin Cat, 1880, the primary document recording the strike, describes multiple confrontations over several days. On the second day, the workers pushed past the gate of the Temple of Meremptah and broke into the storehouses, taking grain directly from the temple grain stores. At another point, the vizier's scribes came down from Thebes to hear their complaint in person, because a complaint that reached the vizier's office was one the central administration had to formally register and respond to, and the workers understood that mechanism precisely. The words in these documents are the words on the limestone flake in Turin. We have not been given our rations. The repetition was not rhetorical. It was the statement of a condition that the administration needed to acknowledge before it could act. The system could not respond to an informal grievance. It could respond to a documented demand. They stated their condition in the language the system required. Eventually, the rations came. The administration partially paid the arrears grain first, the rest in stages over the following weeks. The workers returned to the necropolis, and the project continued. The ostraca and papyri document the strike, recurring at least twice more in the years that followed, the second time with workers citing the first an institutional memory of collective action, recorded in the same administrative documents that tracked their daily output. The shortage itself was systemic, a weakening of the central Egyptian state that continued through the end of the 20th dynasty, and the administrative failures that stopped ration payments were never fully resolved. The workers struck again when conditions demanded it. The rations came. The work continued. Egypt completed Ramesses III's tomb. His name is on every wall. The workers who struck for 18 days to ensure the tomb could be finished, the workers whose action was the mechanism that kept the project alive, appear in the work roster as right side and left side, listed by function, identified by role. The system had a category for what they did. It had no category for putting their names where their labor went. The system could not control the material the workers wrote on. The workers of Deir el-Medina used limestone flakes as scratch paper. A flat piece of limestone from the worksite was free, plentiful, and held ink. Shopping lists went on limestone. Legal complaints went on limestone. Letters to neighbors about borrowed tools that hadn't come back. Notes on a worker's absences from the shift. The day's work roster was written up at the end of each day and then discarded when the next one superseded it. When a piece was full, it went in the rubbish heap outside the village. Nobody archived the rubbish heap. Nobody thought it mattered. The rubbish heap is now the most complete ancient working-class archive in existence. The Deir el-Medina archive the 3,000 ostraca, the papyri, the legal records. The personal letters survived because limestone and fired pottery do not decompose. The village sat in a wadi, a dry valley that flooded seasonally. The ostraca survived that. Fired stone does not absorb water the way papyrus does. The administrative papyri of the Egyptian state sat in archives. Scribes stored them in institutions. The same filing logic that governed everything else about the official record governed them too. What mattered was what the system had a category for, and the system's categories were the pharaoh, the gods, the calendar, the grain levy, the military campaign. When those institutions collapsed, and eventually they all collapse, the papyri collapsed with them. The documents the state thought worth preserving are, in large part, gone. The ostraca survived because they were discarded. The institution that made the workers' names disappear from the walls that had no category for the stonecutter's authorship, only for the pharaoh's name, was the same institution that decided which documents deserved preservation. The system considered the ostraca worthless. The ostraca are what we have. Jaroslav Cherny, the Czech Egyptologist who spent decades cataloguing the Deir el-Medina material, described the archive as providing a resolution of ancient life that exists nowhere else in the ancient world. And by that he meant a paid working community, not a court, not a priesthood, not a military. The love letters exist alongside the work rosters. The medical absence notes exist alongside the legal disputes. The record of who was drunk and missed work exists alongside the record of the strike. Individual names recur across decades of documents, the same foreman appearing in a work roster, then a legal complaint, then an absence record written years later. You can follow a single person's working life across multiple documents. That full texture of daily life, across 400 years, survives for for almost no other ancient community of any kind, let alone a working-class one. The hierarchy of preservation produced this outcome by design. Institutions preserved what they valued and lost it when those institutions fell. The things that institutions threw away were thrown into limestone desert conditions that happened to be optimal for the long-term survival of fired stone. The discarded record outlasted the preserved record. The rubbish heap outlasted the archive. Call it a fingerprint, the shape left by a system that could not imagine what it was discarding. The strike papyrus Turin cat, 1,880, ended up in an institution, the Egyptian Museum, and survived there. But the ostraca, the individual notes, the foreman's limestone scratchpad record that says we have not been given our rations, those survived in the heap. They survived because the institution considered them worthless. They are now irreplaceable. The system that erased the workers' names from in the walls of the tombs also generated the most complete record of those worked in the Himer, in the ancient world, in the accounting, the absence records, the work rosters, the daily administrative apparatus of oversight and control. It kept meticulous track of the people it had no category for honor. The record exists because the system needed it. The system discarded it because it was done with it. Around 1070 BCE, the deteriorating security situation in the Western Desert made the village impossible to sustain, and the state abandoned Deir el-Medina. The administration relocated the workers. The houses stood empty. The rubbish heaps remained. When Bernard Bruyère excavated the site systematically between 1922 and 1951, the heaps were still there, stratified by century, layer after layer of discarded ostraca, representing over 400 years of working life in the deepest strata. Notes from workers dead for 3 centuries before the village was abandoned, still legible. He and his team recovered material that had waited nearly 3,000 years for anyone to consider it worth reading. The material was not hidden. It was not buried by war or disaster. It was in a rubbish heap where the system had put it. Nobody had destroyed it. The institution that decided what mattered had simply moved on. The system could erase the person from the wall. It could not erase the firestone the person wrote on. And most of the people walking past it right now have no idea what they are standing next to. At the entrance to the Valley of the Kings in Luxor, a visitor can rent an audio guide. The site receives roughly 1 million visitors a year. There is a small electric train that runs from the gate to the tomb entrances. The audio guide covers the history of the valley. It covers the discovery of specific tombs. Carter's excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, Belzoni's entry into the tomb of Seti I in 1817. It covers the religious program of the tomb decoration, the meaning of the scenes on the walls, and the texts the pharaoh would use to navigate the underworld. It covers the pharaoh. The audio guide covers the ration system nowhere. The strike of year 29 gets no mention. Deir el-Medina gets no mention. The visitors in those corridors are walking through spaces cut by workers who occupied the forecourts of the pharaoh's mortuary temples for 18 days, refusing to work until the state acknowledged their condition in writing, and the foreman's note recording that event sits in a display case in Turin in the hand of a man whose name the system had no use for. None of this appears in the audio guide. Nobody coordinated it. No committee met to decide that the Valley of the Kings should be presented to the visiting public without reference to the working community that built it. Tourism professionals developed the audio guide from the existing interpretive framework, and that framework descends from a model in which the pharaoh was always the subject. Belzoni pulled sarcophagi for the British Museum. The Metropolitan filled rooms with pharaonic statuary. Champollion deciphered royal cartouches. The stonecutter never appeared in the acquisition register. The system simply reproduces its categories. The pharaoh's name is a category, the stonecutter is not. Deir el-Medina is a separate site, 600 meters southwest of the Valley of the Kings. It has a modest visitor infrastructure. The site where these workers lived their entire lives, raised their children, conducted their legal disputes, wrote their love letters, and went on strike receives a fraction of the visitors that walk through the tombs they built. The audio guide at the Valley of the Kings does not tell you it exists. The foreman's limestone note in Turin does not have a sign above its display case saying you should come and find it. The gap between where the tourists go and where the record lives is the same gap that the system built in 1170 BCE. The system simply has no category for the thing you're trying to name, so the thing has no name. The workers who built the most sacred tombs in the ancient world went on strike because they hadn't been paid. The strike succeeded. Workers completed the tombs. The pharaoh's names are on every wall. The strikers' names are in a rubbish heap in Turin. What survived is this: a limestone flake, a foreman's note, hieratic script, still black against pale stone after 3,000 years, the compressed marks of a man who wrote at speed because the situation could not wait. Nearly 3,200 years old, still readable, still saying the same thing it said when it was written: "We have not been given our rations, we are hungry, we cannot work." The limestone flake is in the Egyptian Museum in Turin. Scholars identify it as Ostracon Cairo CG 25521. Though the museum's own catalogue uses its Turin accession number, it has no dedicated display. It shares a case with other administrative ostraca, the everyday writing materials of the Deir el-Medina workforce, the scratch paper of a community that the official record had no category for commemorating. No sign above it says, "This is the oldest documented record of workers demanding what they were owed." There is a catalogue number, that is all. The case has no interpretive panel, no indication that this piece of fired limestone predates the founding of Rome by 400 years, and no mention of the workers who occupied the temple forecourts until the state fed them. The wings leave it out because the wings were built by a system that had a category for the pharaoh and no category for the man who carved the pharaoh's name. That system is still the one deciding what gets a sign. The note is still there, and the workers are still saying the same thing. The only thing that changed is that now someone is reading it.